Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might shatter your cozy medieval fantasies forever. You know those Christmas card scenes of snow-dusted castles and cheerful peasants gathering around warm hearths? Those Hollywood movies where knights stride through picturesque winter landscapes in their shining armor? Well, I hate to break it to you, but medieval winters weren't a charming backdrop for romance and adventure. They were a 4-month death lottery where your biggest enemies weren't dragons or invading armies, but frostbite, starvation, and the very real possibility of freezing to death in your own bed. So before you get comfortable under your thermostat-controlled central heated blanket, take a moment to appreciate what you're about to learn. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why medieval people didn't write poetry about winter wonderlands. They wrote prayers begging to survive until spring. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But fair warning, you might want to grab an extra blanket. This one's going to get cold. Imagine this. It's January in the year 1347. You're a peasant living in a small village somewhere in northern England. The first thing you need to understand is that you don't wake up because your alarm goes off or because sunlight streams through your window. You wake up because you can't feel your feet anymore, and your body is involuntarily shivering so hard it feels like you're having a seizure. There's no gentle transition from sleep to consciousness. One moment you're dreaming of slightly less freezing times, and the next, you're jerked awake by the kind of cold that feels like tiny knives stabbing every exposed inch of skin. Your breath comes out in thick clouds that hang in the air before settling as frost on your blanket. Yes, that's right. It's so cold inside your home that your breath is literally freezing. Your bed is a joke that even the least comfortable modern prison wouldn't dare call furniture. It's a pile of straw, hopefully dry, but probably not, covered with a rough woolen blanket that's about as insulating as tissue paper. The straw is supposed to provide some barrier between you and the frozen ground, but by morning, your body heat has compressed it into a thin, damp mat that might as well not exist. You're not sleeping alone, of course. Privacy is a luxury that won't be invented for another few centuries. Your entire family, parents, siblings, maybe a grandparent if they've somehow survived past 40, are huddled together in the same pile. On one side, your younger brother's elbow is digging into your ribs. On the other, your sister is hogging what little warmth the shared blanket provides. Someone's feet are in your face. You're pretty sure they haven't been washed since autumn. But here's the thing that would shock modern people the most. You're grateful for every one of those bodies pressed against you. Because in medieval winter, body heat wasn't just comfortable, it was survival. Those annoying elbows and unwashed feet, they're keeping you alive. The alternative is sleeping alone. And sleeping alone in winter means you might not wake up at all. The room, if you can call it that, is pitch black. Windows are a rich person's game, and even if you had them, they'd just be holes in the wall covered with oiled cloth, or, if you're fancy, thin pieces of horn that let in about as much light as a brick. The fire that you carefully banked the night before has died down to barely glowing embers. You can't see them, but you can smell that they're almost out, that sharp, acrid scent of wood giving up its last heat. Getting up is an act of courage that would make modern extreme athletes weep. You have to leave the minimal warmth of your body heat cocoon and venture into air so cold it feels solid. But you have no choice. If that fire goes completely out, rekindling it will take precious time and energy you don't have. Matches won't exist for another 500 years. You'll need to use a flint and steel, assuming your fingers aren't too numb to work them. You're still fully dressed? Of course. Nobody in medieval times owned pajamas. You sleep in the same clothes you wear during the day, a rough linen undertunic and a wool overtunic, both of which haven't been washed since October because washing clothes in winter means they'll never dry. Your clothes aren't just dirty, they're a thriving ecosystem. Lice, fleas, and other small creatures have made their home in the seams. You've gotten used to the constant itching. What choice do you have? As you stumble toward the hearth, your feet hit the floor, and you immediately regret being born. The ground is frozen dirt, possibly covered with a thin layer of rushes or straw, but more likely just bare earth that's as welcoming as an ice rink. If you're lucky enough to own shoes, and that's a big if, they're simple leather turn shoes that provide about as much insulation as wet paper bags. More likely, you're wrapping your feet in rags and hoping for the best. The house itself is actively trying to kill you. The walls are made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks and mud, with gaps that the wind whistles through like a demon's chorus. The roof, thatched with straw, has several holes where the rain and snow get in. There are puddles of ice on the floor where they've frozen overnight. Icicles hang from the inside of your ceiling. Let that sink in. It's so cold inside your house that water freezes indoors, and this is just waking up. You haven't even started your day yet. The real challenges are still ahead. Finding food when the ground is frozen solid, staying warm when firewood is scarce and wet, and somehow making it through another 18 hours of darkness and cold that would make a modern person call it a humanitarian crisis. But you don't call it a crisis. You call it Tuesday. Now that you're awake and have possibly coaxed a few struggling flames back to life in your hearth, it's time to face the morning routine. And by routine, I mean a series of tasks that would qualify as a survival reality show in modern times, except there's no camera crew, no prize money, and definitely no option to tap out. First things first, nature calls. In summer, this is merely unpleasant. In winter, it's a form of torture that would violate the Geneva Convention. Your bathroom is a pit outside if you're lucky, or a corner of the yard if you're not. To get there, you have to venture out into temperatures that make your eyes water and your nose hairs freeze instantly. The path is covered in ice, snow, and the frozen remnants of previous visits that won't decompose until spring. You wrap yourself in every piece of cloth you own, which isn't much. Your cloak is thin, patched in a dozen places, and about as waterproof as a screen door. The moment you step outside, the wind hits you like a physical assault. It doesn't just blow, it finds every gap in your clothing and infiltrates like an icy army. By the time you reach your destination, you're already questioning whether this was really necessary. The actual act is a masterclass in speed and efficiency. There's no leisurely scrolling through ye olde Twitter. You do what needs to be done as fast as humanly possible, while trying not to let any essential parts freeze off. Toilet paper? That's a laugh. You might have some leaves you saved from autumn, now frozen solid and about as comfortable as they sound. Maybe some moss if you planned ahead. Most likely, you're using your left hand and hoping there's some water to wash with later. Spoiler alert, there isn't. Back inside, it's time for breakfast, and I'm using that term loosely. Your morning meal is yesterday's bread, which has now achieved a consistency somewhere between wood and stone. This isn't the artisanal sourdough you're thinking of. This is black bread made from rye, barley, and whatever else could be ground up and called flour, including acorns, chestnuts, and in really bad years, sawdust. It's dense enough to use as a weapon and about as appetizing as the building materials it resembles. You gnaw on it because you have to. Your teeth, already in terrible condition from a lifetime of no dental care, protest with every bite. Cavities are common, abscesses even more so. If you're over 25 and still have most of your teeth, you're considered lucky. The bread is sometimes dipped in ale, yes, even for breakfast, even for children, because the water is frozen solid, and ale is less likely to kill you than whatever might be living in the ice. But here's where winter adds its special touch of misery. Your food stores are running dangerously low. You started winter with grain, some salted meat if you were fortunate, dried beans, and maybe some preserved vegetables. But it's now deep winter, and those supplies are dwindling. The salted pork has long since been eaten. The grain is carefully rationed. You're eating the same gray porridge every single day, made thinner and thinner as supplies run low. Some days you add sawdust to make it seem like more. It doesn't help with nutrition, but it fills the empty space in your stomach. Your cooking pot, the same one used for everything from boiling water to washing clothes, sits over the struggling fire. Everything tastes like smoke because your chimney, if you even have one, doesn't draw properly. More likely, the smoke just fills the room and exits through holes in the roof, leaving everything and everyone coated in a fine layer of soot. Your eyes water constantly. Everyone has a cough. This is normal. Getting dressed for the day isn't really a thing because you never got undressed. You simply add more layers if you have them. Your winter clothing strategy is simple. Wear everything you own simultaneously. This might mean 2 tunics, a cloak, and whatever rags you can wrap around your extremities. Rich people have fur-lined garments. You have a sheep's wool cloak that's been patched so many times it's more thread than original material. The clothing situation reveals one of winter's cruelest jokes. Wool, your primary defense against cold, only works when it's dry. But everything in medieval winter is perpetually damp. The snow melts on your clothes, your sweat from working freezes, and the humidity from everyone breathing in a small space ensures nothing ever fully dries. So you're not just cold, you're cold and wet, which is exponentially worse. Your shoes, if you can call them that, are already soaked through. They're simple leather affairs with no real soul, held together with hope and sinew. Waterproofing consists of rubbing them with animal fat when you can spare it, which is never. Your feet will be wet and cold from now until spring. Frostbite is so common it has dozens of folk names, none of them pleasant. And here's a fun detail that medieval life throws in for free. Everything hurts more in the cold. That old injury from harvesting? It's screaming now. The joints that were just stiff in autumn are now so painful you can barely move. There's no ibuprofen, no heating pads, no relief. You just hurt constantly, and that's your life now. By the time you've completed your morning routine, toilet, breakfast, adding more smoky wood to the fire, it's still dark outside. The sun won't make its brief appearance for hours yet. In deep winter, you might get 6 or 7 hours of weak daylight, and that's if the weather is clear. More often, the sky is a heavy gray blanket that makes it hard to tell day from night. But you can't stay inside. There's work to be done, animals to be fed, water to be fetched, and every single one of these tasks becomes exponentially harder when the world is frozen solid. The well is 200 yards away, and the ice on top is 3 inches thick. The axe handle burns your hands with cold even through your mittens. The chicken's water is frozen solid and needs to be thawed. This is just the beginning of your day, and already you're exhausted, cold, and hungry. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know this: it's going to get worse before it gets better. Spring is still months away. Your food stores are dwindling. The cold is relentless. Welcome to morning in medieval winter. You've been awake for an hour, and you're already wondering if maybe the Vikings had the right idea about Valhalla. At least it's probably warm there. Now that you've survived the morning routine, let's talk about humanity's greatest battle in medieval times: the war against cold. This wasn't a war you could win. At best, you could negotiate a temporary ceasefire where you didn't actually die. The cold was like a siege army surrounding your village, patient and relentless, waiting for your defenses to fail. Your house, and I'm being generous with that term, is your primary fortification in this war, and it's about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. Let's examine your defensive positions, shall we? The walls, as I mentioned, are wattle and daub. For those unfamiliar with this architectural disaster, imagine taking some sticks, weaving them together like a basket, then slapping mud on both sides and calling it a day. In summer, this actually works reasonably well. In winter, the mud cracks, chunks fall out, and what you're left with is essentially a stick fence pretending to be a wall. The wind doesn't just blow through these cracks, it sets up residents and invites its friends. You've tried to plug the gaps with whatever you can find: straw, rags, more mud, dried grass, animal hair, and in desperate times, actual animal dung mixed with straw. Yes, you're literally living in a house partially made of feces, but when the alternative is freezing to death, you stop being picky about your building materials. The roof is another comedy of errors. Thatch looks quaint in pictures, but in reality, it's a thick layer of straw that's constantly rotting, leaking, and housing entire civilizations of mice, birds, and insects. In winter, it becomes waterlogged from snow, which then freezes, creating an ice cap on your house that slowly melts during the day, dripping ice-cold water on everything inside. You've placed pots and bowls under the worst leaks, but they freeze overnight, creating little indoor ice sculptures that would be charming if they weren't a sign of your impending hypothermia. Your floor is dirt, not packed earth that's been treated and sealed, just dirt. In winter, this becomes frozen mud that never quite thaws. Walking barefoot is like walking on frozen concrete, except concrete doesn't turn into slippery mush when it finally does warm up slightly near the fire. You've spread rushes or straw on the floor, but these quickly become damp and start rotting, adding a delightful decomposition smell to your already fragrant home. But the real battle is fought at the hearth. Fire is life in medieval winter, and keeping it going is a full-time job that makes modern heating systems look like magic. First, you need wood, and not just any wood. Dry wood. Have you ever tried to find dry wood in the middle of winter when everything has been soaked by snow and rain for months? It's like trying to find a politician who keeps their promises. You spent autumn gathering wood, but here's the catch-22 of medieval life. You have nowhere dry to store it. Your wood pile is outside, covered with whatever you could find: old thatch, a few boards, prayers to various saints. But winter moisture finds its way in, and now your firewood is about as flammable as the bottom of a lake. You bring it inside to dry by the fire, but that means using dry wood to dry wet wood, which is the kind of circular logic that makes you question the meaning of existence. When you do manage to get a fire going, it's a smoky, inefficient affair. Your chimney, if you have one, is just a hole in the roof with a hood over it. Most of the heat goes straight up and out, while most of the smoke stays in. Your eyes are perpetually red and weeping. Everyone has a chronic cough that sounds like they're trying to expel their lungs. The ceiling is black with soot, which occasionally falls in chunks onto your food, adding a delightful charcoal seasoning to every meal. The fire has to be constantly tended. Let it die down too much, and you'll spend precious time and energy getting it started again. But keep it too high, and you'll burn through your wood supply before winter's end. It's a delicate balance that requires constant attention. Someone always has to be watching, feeding, adjusting. At night, you bank the fire, covering the coals with ashes to keep them alive, but not burning. If you do it wrong, you wake up to a cold hearth and the kind of despair that makes you understand why medieval people believed in hell. At least it was warm. But here's the truly diabolic part. Even with a fire going constantly, your house never gets warm. The best you can hope for is not actively freezing. The area right next to the fire might be tolerable, even uncomfortably hot if you're too close. But step 3 feet away, and you're back in the Arctic. The temperature differential in your one-room house can be 40 degrees or more. You're constantly rotating like a rotisserie chicken, warming one side while the other freezes. And we haven't even talked about the nights yet. Oh, the nights. When the sun goes down, which in deep winter is around 4 p.m., the temperature plummets. Whatever pitiful heat you've built up during the day vanishes like your hopes of ever being warm again. You huddle closer to the fire, but you can't sleep right next to it, because rolling into the hearth while unconscious is a real and present danger. So you retreat to your straw pile on every piece of fabric you own, and spend the night in a state of semi-consciousness, shivering yourself awake every hour. Your blankets, such as they are, provide about as much insulation as a wet paper towel. Wool is warm when dry, but nothing in your house is ever truly dry in winter. The humidity from breathing, cooking, and the occasional leak ensures that everything exists in a state of perpetual dampness. Your blanket isn't keeping you warm. It's just trapping a layer of slightly less cold air next to your body. Some nights it gets so cold that the water in your cooking pot freezes solid. Your breath freezes on your blanket, creating a crusty layer of ice that you'll have to break in the morning. The ale freezes. The milk, if you have any, freezes. Sometimes you wake up to find that your hair has frozen to the wall you were sleeping against. This is the reality of winter housing in medieval times. You're not living in a home. You're camping in a badly constructed shelter that happens to have walls. The cold isn't outside trying to get in. It's already inside, living with you like the world's worst roommate. And this is your life for 4 to 5 months of every year. But surely you think there must be some solutions? Some clever medieval life hacks for staying warm? Oh, there are. Let me tell you about them. They're exactly as effective as you'd expect from a society that thought disease was caused by bad smells. Let's talk about everyone's favorite subject: food. Except in medieval winter, food isn't a subject that brings joy. It's a source of constant anxiety, careful calculation, and the kind of rationing that would make a doomsday prepper weep with sympathy. Remember that harvest you brought in during autumn? Those grain stores that seemed so plentiful when you were threshing in September? Well, it's January now, and you're starting to realize that math is not your friend. You have to make your food last until the next harvest, which is 8 months away. 8 months, and that's assuming the next harvest is good, which, given medieval agricultural techniques and the whims of weather, is like assuming your teenager will clean their room without being asked. Your daily caloric intake in winter would make a modern nutritionist call the authorities. You're looking at maybe 1,500 calories on a good day, and that's if you're lucky. For context, a modern person doing the kind of physical labor medieval peasants did would need at least 3,000 to 4,000 calories. You're operating at less than half capacity, and it shows. Everyone is losing weight they can't afford to lose. Cheekbones aren't fashionable. They're a sign of impending starvation. Your diet consists of a few stellar options, each more depressing than the last. There's bread, which I've already described as having the consistency and flavor of building materials. You're eating less of it each day as supplies dwindle. What started as a pound per person per day in October is now down to half that, and it'll get smaller as winter progresses. Then there's porridge, or pottage as it's called, which is basically whatever grains you have left boiled into a gray slurry. In good times, you might add vegetables, a bit of bacon fat, maybe some herbs. In deep winter, it's just grain and water, cooked until it reaches the consistency of wallpaper paste. You eat it because it's warm and it fills the empty space in your stomach, not because it provides any joy or significant nutrition. Meat is a memory. Whatever animals you slaughtered in autumn, usually the ones you couldn't afford to feed through winter, were salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved. But salt is expensive, and your preservation techniques are, shall we say, imperfect. That ham hanging from your rafters isn't aging like fine wine. It's developing new and exciting forms of mold. You scrape off the worst bits and eat it anyway because protein is protein, even if it tastes like it's been marinated in death. Fresh vegetables don't exist. Your winter vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, are stored in a root cellar, which is really just a hole in the ground. By January, they're either freezing solid every night and thawing every day, which turns them to mush, or they're sprouting, rotting, or both. You eat them anyway. Mushy turnips are still calories. Dairy products are scarce because your cow, if you're rich enough to have one, isn't producing much milk on a diet of old hay and prayers. Whatever milk you do get is probably made into cheese or butter, which last longer than fresh milk. But last longer is relative when you have no refrigeration and everything is stored in conditions that would make a health inspector faint. Here's a fun winter dietary supplement. Tree bark. No, seriously. When things get really bad, people strip the inner bark from trees, dry it, grind it, and add it to their bread flour. It adds bulk, if not nutrition. Pine needles are boiled into a tea that provides a tiny bit of vitamin C and tastes like drinking a Christmas tree. Acorns, despite being incredibly bitter and requiring extensive processing to be edible, become a regular part of the diet. And then there's the protein source no one talks about in the history books. Rats. They're plentiful, they're meaty, and they're one of the few animals stupid enough to stick around human habitations in winter. Catching them is a fun family activity that combines pest control with dinner preparation. The taste is, well, let's just say hunger is the best sauce. But the real killer isn't just the lack of food, it's the lack of variety. You're eating the same things every single day. Porridge for breakfast, bread, and maybe some cheese for lunch. Porridge again for dinner, perhaps with a tiny bit of salted meat if it's a special occasion. Your body craves nutrients you can't even name. Scurvy starts setting in by late winter. Your gums bleed, old wounds reopen, and you bruise if someone looks at you too hard. Children suffer the most. Their growing bodies need nutrients that simply aren't available. Rickets is common from lack of vitamin D. The sun barely shows itself, and when it does, everyone is too bundled up to absorb any rays. Children's legs bow, their growth stunts, and they develop that pinched, old person look that medieval paintings capture so disturbingly well. And through all of this, you're still expected to work. An empty stomach doesn't excuse you from feeding the animals, hauling water, or maintaining the fire. You work through the hunger pangs, through the weakness, through the dizzy spells that come from low blood sugar and lower morale. The psychological toll is almost worse than the physical one. You know that every meal eaten is one meal closer to running out completely. You watch your stores dwindle and count the weeks until spring, doing the kind of depressing math that always comes out wrong. Do you eat more now to maintain strength for work, risking starvation later? Or do you ration harder, risking becoming too weak to work at all? Some families make the heartbreaking decision to have fewer mouths to feed. Elderly relatives might go for a walk in the snow and not come back. Newborns might not be fed as diligently as they should be. These aren't acts of cruelty. They're acts of desperate mathematics when the equation of survival doesn't balance. By February, the real hunger months begin. Everything that could be preserved has been eaten. The stored vegetables are gone or rotten. The grain is running dangerously low. You start looking at the seed grain, the stuff you need to plant in spring, with hungry eyes. Eating your seed grain is like eating your future. But when your children are crying from hunger, the future seems less important than today. This is when people start doing desperate things. They range farther into the forests, despite the cold and the wolves, looking for anything edible. They dig through snow looking for forgotten caches of nuts. They eye their neighbors' stores with envy, and sometimes worse. Winter theft isn't about greed, it's about survival. And the penalties for theft are harsh, but starving is harsher. The irony is that you're surrounded by potential food you can't access. Rivers and ponds are frozen solid, locking away fish. The ground is too hard to dig for roots. Birds have migrated, and the few winter birds remaining are too smart and too fast for easy catching. Even if you could hunt, which as a peasant you probably can't legally do, the deer and wild boar are struggling to survive too, and they're a lot better at it than you are. This is the reality of winter eating in medieval times. It's not a diet. It's a slow starvation punctuated by just enough calories to keep you alive, but not enough to keep you healthy. You're not living, you're persisting, one gray meal at a time, counting the days until spring while hoping you have enough fingers left from frostbite to count that high. You know what's fun? Essential life-sustaining resources becoming actively hostile to your existence. Water in medieval winter isn't just inconvenient, it's transformed into a malevolent entity that seems personally offended by your need to drink, cook, and occasionally wash. Let's start with the basic problem. Water freezes. I know, shocking revelation. But until you've lived in a world without indoor plumbing, you can't appreciate what this really means. Every single drop of water you need has to be fetched, carried, and somehow kept liquid long enough to use. This is like having to complete an obstacle course every time you want a glass of water, except the obstacles are trying to kill you. Your water source is probably a well shared by the village, located exactly far enough away to be incredibly inconvenient, but not so far that you die getting there. In summer, this is merely annoying. In winter, it's a death march. The path is covered in ice that's been polished to a lethal sheen by hundreds of trips. You're carrying wooden buckets that weigh about 40 pounds when full, wearing shoes that have the grip of a banana peel, and trying not to die. But first, you have to get the water out of the well. The rope is frozen stiff and covered in ice that cuts your hands even through whatever rags you've wrapped them in. The bucket at the end is frozen to the rope and needs to be beaten loose. Then you lower it down, hoping the well hasn't frozen solid. If it has, congratulations. You get to spend the next hour with a pole or axe, trying to break through ice that's harder than your will to live. The water, when you finally get it up, is so cold it hurts. Not refreshing cold, painful cold. The kind of cold that makes your teeth ache just looking at it. Your hands, already numb from the wind, go completely dead as you handle the wet rope and bucket. Frostbite isn't a danger, it's a guarantee. Everyone's fingers are black at the tips by February. Now comes the fun part, getting the water home before it freezes. You're racing against thermodynamics, and thermodynamics always wins. The water starts forming ice crystals before you've gone 10 steps. By the time you get home, the top layer is solid. You'll need to break it again just to pour it out. But wait, the fun doesn't stop there. Where do you store this water once you're home? Your house, as we've established, is basically outdoors with a roof. Any water left standing will freeze solid overnight. Your cooking pot, your washing basin, any container with water in it becomes a solid block of ice by morning. You wake up needing water for cooking and have to melt ice first, which requires a fire, which requires unfrozen water to help get it started. Do you see the problem? This creates a constant cycle of melting and refreezing. You melt snow or ice by the fire, use what you need immediately, and watch the rest freeze again. Every single task requiring water, cooking, cleaning, drinking, requires advanced planning and constant heat. You can't just turn on a tap. You need to budget time and firewood for water procurement like it's a part-time job, because it is. Speaking of snow, surely that's easier than breaking through well ice? Just scoop it up and melt it, right? Wrong. First, it takes an enormous amount of snow to make a small amount of water. You need about 10 buckets of snow to get 1 bucket of water. Second, melting snow takes forever and uses precious firewood. Third, and this is the fun part, snow isn't clean. It's full of soot from fires, bird droppings, and whatever else has been floating around in medieval air quality. But when you're thirsty, you stop being picky. Washing is, well, let's just say standards are different. A full bath in winter is about as common as a unicorn sighting. You might wash your face and hands occasionally, using water heated by the fire and trying to be quick before it freezes again. Your body hasn't seen soap since October, and it's not going to until April at the earliest. Everyone smells like smoke, sweat, and desperation. But when everyone smells the same, no one notices. Washing clothes in winter? That's a laugh. Clothes are worn continuously until they either fall apart or become so stiff with dirt and sweat that they stand up on their own. If something absolutely must be washed, say because it's covered in something even medieval standards can't ignore, you heat water, scrub quickly, and then hang the item by the fire where it will take days to dry and probably freeze solid at least once in the process. But here's where medieval water gets really special. It's trying to kill you even when it's liquid. Without modern water treatment, every source is contaminated with exciting things like bacteria, parasites, and whatever died upstream last week. In summer, this leads to dysentery and other fun digestive adventures. In winter, when your immune system is already compromised by cold and malnutrition, contaminated water is even more dangerous. This is why everyone drinks ale or wine when possible. The fermentation process kills some of the nasties, and alcohol doesn't freeze as easily as water. Even children drink weak ale because it's safer than water. Of course, staying slightly drunk all winter presents its own challenges. But when the alternative is death by waterborne illness, you learn to function with a low-level buzz. The water situation affects everything. Cooking takes longer because you're constantly melting ice. Cleaning is basically non-existent. Animals need water too, which means either breaking ice on troughs multiple times a day or hauling water for them as well. Every aspect of life that we take for granted becomes a complex negotiation with frozen water. And then there's the ultimate water-related winter catastrophe, when your roof leaks during a thaw. The ice dam on your thatch melts just enough to send water streaming into your house, where it promptly freezes again on your floor, your belongings, and possibly you, if you're unlucky enough to be underneath it. Now you have an indoor ice rink that won't melt until spring, making your already miserable living conditions somehow worse. The constant battle with water shapes your entire day. You can't just decide to have tea. You need to factor in ice-breaking time, melting time, and the fuel cost. You can't wash a dish without planning ahead. You measure every drop because each one represents time, energy, and frostbitten fingers. This is medieval water management, a relentless struggle against physics where water, the substance you need to live, seems determined to make that life as difficult as possible. It's not just an inconvenience. It's a full-time job with terrible working conditions and no benefits, except continued existence. And speaking of existence, you know what makes everything about medieval winter even more fun? Being sick. Because when your body is already weakened by cold, hunger, and dehydration, what it really needs is a good dose of medieval medicine. Picture this. It's the dead of winter. You're already malnourished, freezing and exhausted, and then you start feeling that telltale tickle in your throat. In modern times, this means a trip to the pharmacy and maybe a sick day. In medieval times, this means you're about to experience health care that makes waterboarding look like a spa treatment. Let's start with the common cold, which in medieval winter isn't common, it's universal. Everyone has it. The coughing in your one-room house sounds like a tuberculosis ward, which it might actually be since nobody can diagnose the difference. Your nose runs constantly, freezing into little icicles on your face that you have to break off periodically. There's no tissues, so you use your sleeve, which is already so crusted with various bodily fluids that adding snot barely registers. But a cold is the least of your worries. Winter is prime time for the real killers: pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis, and various mystery illnesses that medieval medicine lumps together as bad air or an excess of phlegm. Your body, weakened by malnutrition and constant cold exposure, has the immune system of a wet paper bag. What starts as sniffles can progress to death with alarming speed. When you get sick, not if, when, your treatment options range from useless to actively harmful. The local healer, who might be the village wise woman, the barber, or just someone who owns a sharp knife and claims to know what they're doing, has a whole arsenal of cures that definitely won't help and might actually finish you off. First up, bloodletting. Because when you're already weak from illness, what you really need is to lose more blood. The theory is that illness is caused by bad humors in your blood, so obviously the solution is to drain it out. They'll either cut you with a frighteningly dirty blade or apply leeches, which at least have the decency to numb the area before sucking your life force out. The amount of blood they take would horrify a modern doctor, sometimes pints at a time. If you weren't dying before, you might be now. But wait, there's more. Perhaps your illness is caused by too much bile? Time for purging. You'll be given concoctions made from herbs that will make you vomit and have diarrhea simultaneously. In a house with no running water, no toilet, and freezing temperatures, this is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. You'll spend hours crouched over a bucket, losing fluids you can't afford to lose, while your family tries to pretend this isn't happening 3 feet away from where they're eating. The herbal remedies are a mixed bag of might actually help, definitely won't help, and sweet mercy, what were they thinking? Willow bark tea actually contains a precursor to aspirin, so that's helpful. But then they'll also recommend wearing a dead toad around your neck to ward off fever, or rubbing your chest with a mixture of goose fat and earthworms. The placebo effect is working overtime here. For respiratory illnesses, the treatments are especially creative. You might be told to inhale the smoke from burning herbs, which in your already smoke-filled house just adds to the general air quality disaster. Or they might cup you, placing heated cups on your back to draw out the illness, leaving you with painful welts that do nothing except make lying down even more uncomfortable than it already was. Got a fever? You need cooling, obviously. This might involve being stripped naked and left in an unheated room, or having snow packed around you. Because nothing helps a fever like hypothermia. Alternatively, they might decide you need to sweat it out and pile every available blanket on you while stoking the fire to sauna temperatures. Either way, you're in for a bad time. Dental problems in winter are their own special hell. Your teeth, already damaged by a lifetime of poor nutrition and no dental care, become extra sensitive in cold weather. Cavities feel like someone's driving nails into your jaw. An abscess can kill you through blood infection, but the treatment is somehow worse than the disease. The barber surgeon will try to pull the tooth with pliers that haven't been cleaned since the last patient. No anesthesia, except maybe a stiff drink if you're lucky. The extraction is done by brute force, often breaking the tooth and leaving fragments that will cause infection. If you survive the procedure, you get to heal in freezing conditions that make the pain worse. Children's illnesses are particularly heartbreaking. Whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever, diseases that modern medicine prevents or easily treats, are death sentences here. Parents watch their children struggle to breathe, burn with fever, or waste away from diarrheal diseases. The treatments are the same brutal remedies applied to adults, but on tiny bodies that can't handle the trauma. Child mortality in winter approaches 50% in bad years. The psychological aspect of illness is devastating. You know that getting sick in winter dramatically reduces your chances of seeing spring. Every cough could be the beginning of the end. Families start mentally preparing for loss the moment someone falls ill. There's a resigned fatalism to it all, God's will and all that, but also a desperate scramble to try anything that might help. Quarantine isn't really a thing. How can you isolate someone in a one-room house? The sick and the healthy share the same space, breathe the same air, use the same utensils. When one person gets ill, everyone gets ill. It ripples through families and villages like wildfire, except slower and more painful. The cures often make things worse. Mercury is used for various ailments, slowly poisoning patients. Lead-based cosmetics and medicines add their own toxic effects. Prayers are prescribed alongside treatments, and when the patient dies anyway, it's blamed on insufficient faith rather than mercury poisoning. Wounds that would be minor in summer become life-threatening in winter. A small cut can't heal properly when you're malnourished and cold. It gets infected, the infection spreads, and soon you're looking at gangrene. The treatment? Amputation with a saw that's seen better days, no anesthesia except maybe hitting you on the head first, and cauterization with a red-hot iron. The survival rate is what you'd expect from surgery performed by someone who also cuts hair for a living. Mental health in winter is another unrecognized disaster. Seasonal depression is very real when the season is actively trying to kill you. But there's no concept of mental health care. Depression is called melancholy and treated with more bloodletting or prayers. Anxiety is considered demonic possession. Post-traumatic stress from watching family members die is just part of life. The isolation makes everything worse. In bad weather, you might not see anyone outside your family for weeks. No news, no social support, no distractions from the reality of your situation. Just you, your sick family members, and the constant sound of coughing, wheezing, and the wind howling through the cracks in your walls. By the time you've gotten through the worst of winter illness, if you've survived, you're a shadow of your former self. You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose. Your body is scarred from various treatments, and your immune system is shot. You're alive, technically, but you're weakened right when you need strength for the intense labor of spring planting. This is medieval medicine in winter. A combination of suffering, superstition, and treatments that often hasten the death they were meant to prevent. It's not healing. It's hoping you're strong enough to survive both the disease and the cure. You might think that shared hardship would bring medieval communities together in winter. Everyone huddling together, sharing resources, supporting each other through the dark months like a heartwarming Christmas special. Well, I hate to break it to you, but winter didn't bring out the best in medieval society. It brought out the desperate, the cruel, and the every family for themselves mentality that makes Black Friday shoppers look civilized. Let's start with the basic social unit, the family. In normal times, medieval families were already crammed together in close quarters. Add in winter's forced confinement, and you've got a pressure cooker of human misery. You're trapped in a single room with your entire extended family for months. There's no privacy, no personal space, and no escape. Every annoying habit is magnified. Every old argument resurfaces. That thing your brother did 6 years ago? You're still mad about it, and now you have 4 months to stew on it while sitting 3 feet away from him. Domestic violence increases dramatically in winter. Men, frustrated by their inability to work and provide, take it out on their wives and children. Women, exhausted by trying to make insufficient food stretch and keeping everyone from freezing, snap under the pressure. Children, cooped up with no outlet for energy and constantly hungry, become unmanageable. The stick used for stirring porridge doubles as a disciplinary tool. What happens in the house stays in the house, because who's going to intervene? Everyone else is dealing with their own domestic disasters. The elderly become a particularly heartbreaking burden. In a society with no social safety net, old people who can no longer work are just extra mouths to feed. Some families care for their elderly with touching devotion. Others, well, there are stories of old people going to live with relatives in the next village and never being seen again, or taking a walk in the woods and not coming back. It's not murder exactly, it's just not trying very hard to prevent death. Mental illness, unrecognized and untreated, explodes in winter conditions. What we'd now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, or psychotic breaks are labeled as possession, witchcraft, or divine punishment. The village madman isn't getting therapy, he's chained in someone's barn if he's lucky, or driven out into the snow if he's not. Women who break under the strain might be accused of witchcraft, especially if their breakdown coincides with someone else's misfortune. Interfamily relationships become strained to breaking. That neighbor you've had land disputes with? Winter is when old feuds turn violent. Resources are scarce, and everyone knows exactly how much food their neighbors have. Theft increases dramatically, not casual pilfering, but desperate raids on grain stores and root cellars. Getting caught stealing food in winter might mean hanging, but not stealing might mean starving. People make calculated decisions about which risk is worse. The church, which should be a source of comfort and community support, becomes another source of stress. You're required to attend services, but the church is unheated, and standing through Latin Mass while freezing is its own form of torture. The priest demands tithes, even when you have nothing to give. 10% of nothing is still nothing, but try explaining that to a church that needs its own winter supplies. Miss too many services or fail to tithe, and you risk excommunication, which in a medieval village is social death. Speaking of death, winter funerals are their own special horror. The ground is frozen solid, making burial extremely difficult. Bodies might be stored in outbuildings until the ground thaws enough to dig, which is exactly as traumatic as it sounds. If someone dies during a blizzard, their body might be kept in the house for days until weather permits burial. Imagine trying to go about your daily life with grandma's corpse in the corner, frozen solid and waiting for spring. Social hierarchies become more pronounced and cruel in winter. The lord of the manor still expects his rents and services, regardless of whether you're starving. In fact, he might increase demands, knowing that desperate people will agree to anything for a bit of extra food. Corvée labor, the unpaid work peasants owe their lord, doesn't stop for winter. You might be required to repair roads, clear snow, or maintain the lord's buildings while your own family freezes. Justice becomes harsher and more arbitrary. The manorial court still meets, and punishments for crimes become more severe when resources are scarce. Steal a chicken in summer, and you might get a fine or a beating. Steal a chicken in winter, and you might hang. The stocks and pillory, horrible enough in good weather, become potential death sentences when it's below freezing. Village solidarity, such as it is, operates on strict reciprocity. Help your neighbor today because you might need help tomorrow. But if someone is seen as not pulling their weight, taking more than they give, or worst of all, hoarding resources, they're quickly ostracized. Being shunned by the village in winter is essentially a death sentence. No one will trade with you, help you, or even acknowledge your existence. Children suffer in unique ways. Education, minimal in the best of times, stops completely in winter. Children are expected to work as soon as they can walk, gathering firewood, tending animals, helping with endless domestic tasks. Play is a summer luxury. Toys are non-existent. Childhood ends early when survival is on the line. The psychological damage of growing up in constant cold, hunger, and fear shapes entire generations. Marriage becomes a survival strategy rather than a romantic choice. Young women might marry whoever can feed them through winter. Widows remarry quickly or starve. Love matches are for people who aren't worried about their next meal. The marriage ceremony itself might be delayed until spring when travel is possible and the church isn't a frozen tomb. Even friendship becomes transactional. You maintain relationships that might benefit you and let others fade. That friend who used to share ale and stories? If they have nothing to offer in winter, you gradually stop visiting. It's not personal, it's practical. Every social interaction has to be weighed against the energy it takes to leave your house and the resources it might consume. The psychological toll of this social isolation and cruelty is immense. People develop what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD from the repeated trauma of winter survival. But there's no therapy, no understanding of trauma, no support groups. You just carry the damage forward, passing it on to your children, who will pass it on to theirs. The social fabric doesn't just fray in medieval winter. It tears apart and is rewoven into something harder, crueler, and more pragmatic. Communities don't come together. They calculate who's worth saving and who's not. Families don't grow closer. They endure each other because the alternative is death. Friends become resources to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished. This is the hidden cruelty of medieval winter. Not just the cold and hunger, but the way it strips away the thin veneer of civilization and reveals the desperate animal beneath. Every person becomes a potential threat or resource. Every relationship is conditional. Every kindness has a price. And through it all, you maintain the fiction that this is normal, that this is just how life is, that God wills it so. Because acknowledging the full horror of your situation would break something inside you that you can't afford to break. Not when you still have 3 more months of winter to survive. You might think that winter would at least give medieval peasants a break from backbreaking labor. After all, the fields are frozen, the crops are in, what's left to do besides survive? Oh, you sweet summer child. Winter work wasn't just difficult. It was difficult while everything was actively trying to kill you. Let's start with the animals, because unlike you, they can't understand why their world has turned into a frozen hellscape. Your livestock, if you're lucky enough to have any, need daily care that becomes exponentially harder when everything is covered in ice and your fingers stop working after 30 seconds outside. Your chickens, those reliable egg producers, have mostly stopped laying because there's not enough daylight or food to trigger their reproductive systems. But you still need to feed them, water them, and most importantly, keep them from freezing to death. Have you ever tried to collect eggs when they're frozen solid the moment they're laid? It's like an Easter egg hunt where the prize is disappointment, and the eggs might shatter in your numb hands. The family pig, if it survived the autumn slaughter, is now your roommate. Yes, you're sharing living space with a pig, because leaving it outside means losing your primary protein investment to the cold. The pig doesn't understand house rules. It doesn't care about your sleeping schedule. It just knows it's cold, hungry, and confused about why it's living indoors. The smell is indescribable, but you get used to it because the alternative is no bacon come next autumn. Your cow, the family's most valuable possession after the house itself, needs constant attention. Twice a day, you're breaking ice on water troughs with an axe, your hands so cold you can't feel the handle. The cow's water consumption hasn't decreased just because it's winter, but every bucket of water is a heroic quest involving ice, distance, and the very real possibility of slipping and breaking something important. Mucking out animal stalls can't wait for spring. In fact, it's worse in winter, because everything freezes into concrete-like blocks that have to be chipped out with tools that weren't designed for this. You're essentially doing archaeological excavation on frozen manure while your back screams and your nose runs continuously. The manure pile outside grows into a frozen monument to your misery, waiting for spring when it can be spread on the fields. But animals are just the beginning. Firewood doesn't cut itself, and your autumn supply is dwindling faster than expected because this winter is colder than last year. So you're heading into the forest with an axe that's seen better days, looking for dead wood that's not too wet to burn. Chopping wood in winter is its own special hell. The axe bounces off frozen wood like it's made of iron. When you do split a log, it often shatters into useless splinters. Your hands, already cracked and bleeding from the cold, develop new blisters that immediately burst and freeze. The forest in winter is a peaceful wonderland of Christmas cards. It's dark, even at midday. The trees crack and groan with ice. Branches, overloaded with snow, fall without warning. Wolves, hungry and desperate, are bolder than in summer. You're constantly looking over your shoulder, working as fast as your frozen body allows, because being in the forest after dark is a death sentence. Hauling the wood back is another adventure. You've got a sledge if you're lucky, just your back if you're not. The path is icy, the load is heavy, and every step is a negotiation with gravity. Drop the wood, and you'll spend precious energy collecting it again. Fall and injure yourself, and you might not make it home before dark or hypothermia sets in. Home repairs can't wait either. That gap in the wall that seemed minor in autumn is now whistling like a demon and letting in enough cold air to freeze the entire room. So you're out there with numb fingers trying to mix mud that won't mix because it's frozen, applying patches that won't stick because everything is ice, knowing that your repair will probably fall off tomorrow, but doing it anyway, because what else can you do? Thatching repairs are particularly delightful. Climbing onto an ice-covered roof with bundles of straw, trying to patch holes while the wind tries to throw you off, your hands too numb to properly tie anything down. One wrong move and you're sliding off onto frozen ground, possibly breaking bones that won't heal properly because medieval medicine is, as we've established, mostly hopes and prayers with a side of accidental poisoning. Water collection isn't just a morning task, it's an all-day occupation. Animals need water. Cooking needs water. That fire you're desperately maintaining needs water nearby in case it gets out of control. Each trip to the well is a careful calculation of energy expenditure versus necessity. You develop a complex mental map of where ice is thickest, which paths are most treacherous, and exactly how much water you can carry without falling. Tool maintenance becomes critical when you can't just pop to the medieval equivalent of Home Depot for replacements. Your axe needs sharpening, but the whetstone is frozen and your hands shake too much for precision work. Your saw is rusting from the constant damp. Your shovel handle, made of wood that's repeatedly frozen and thawed, is developing cracks that will eventually snap at the worst possible moment. If you're a craftsman, your trade doesn't stop for winter. The blacksmith still needs to work, but imagine maintaining forge temperature when it's below freezing. The potter's clay freezes solid. The carpenter's glue won't set. The weaver's fingers are too stiff to work the loom properly. Everyone's productivity drops, but the demands don't. The Lord still wants his horseshoes, pots, furniture, and cloth. Even basic household tasks become Herculean efforts. Grinding grain with frozen hands on a hand-powered quern. Spinning thread when you can't feel your fingers. Mending clothes by candlelight when the sun sets at 4 p.m. Every simple task takes 3 times as long and requires 10 times the effort. The real killer is that all this work is being done on a caloric deficit. You're burning enormous amounts of energy just staying warm, then being asked to perform hard physical labor on a diet of watery porridge and hope. Your body is eating itself, consuming muscle mass to keep vital organs functioning. But the work must continue because stopping means death, if not from cold, then from starvation when your animals die or your wood runs out. And through it all, there's the psychological torture of knowing this will continue for months. This isn't a bad week, you just need to push through. This is your life, from November to March, every single year, until you die. The work never stops, never gets easier, and never pays enough to actually get ahead. You're running on a treadmill where slowing down means freezing to death. This is the reality of winter work in medieval times, not a season of rest, but a season where every basic task becomes a boss battle, where your tools actively fight you, and where the reward for a hard day's work is surviving to do it again tomorrow. Let's talk about medieval winter fashion. And by fashion, I mean the desperate art of not freezing to death using only cheap products and determination. Your winter wardrobe makes modern minimalism look excessive because you own maybe 3 pieces of clothing total and you're wearing all of them simultaneously. Starting from the inside out, let's examine this sartorial disaster. Your underwear, if you're fancy enough to have any, is a linen shirt that hasn't been washed since October. Linen is great in summer, breathable, comfortable, relatively easy to clean. In winter, it's about as insulating as wearing wet newspaper. But it's what you've got, so you wear it, and it slowly transforms from white to a color that doesn't exist in nature, a grayish brown that speaks of months of sweat, smoke, and sadness. Over this goes your wool tunic. And when I say wool, I don't mean the soft merino wool of your fancy modern sweaters. I mean rough, scratchy, poorly spun wool that feels like wearing a hair shirt designed by someone who hates you. It's been felted by repeated wearing and moisture, so it's simultaneously stiff and saggy. The original color is a mystery lost to time and dirt. If you're a woman, you're wearing a long dress made of the same horrible wool, which has the added bonus of dragging through mud, snow, and whatever else is on the ground. The hem is perpetually wet and frozen, slapping against your legs with every step like a reminder that comfort is for people who don't live in the 14th century. Layers are your only defense against cold, but medieval layering isn't a sophisticated system of moisture-wicking base layers and insulating mid-layers. It's put on everything you own and hope for the best. Your second tunic goes over the first, assuming you own a second tunic. It's usually your good one, saved for church and special occasions, but winter doesn't care about your dress codes. Your cloak is supposedly the main defense against the elements. It's a rectangle of wool, possibly lined with rabbit fur if you're wealthy, more likely lined with more wool if you're not. It fastens with a brooch or pin that's constantly coming undone, dumping snow down your neck at the worst possible moments. The cloak is heavy when dry, but it's never dry in winter. It absorbs moisture like a sponge, becoming progressively heavier throughout the day until you're essentially wearing a wet blanket that smells like a sheep that died disappointed. Hoods are attached to cloaks or worn separately, but they don't work like modern hoods. They're either too loose, letting in wind and snow, or so tight they cut off circulation to your brain. They block peripheral vision, muffle hearing, and generally make you vulnerable to everything from low branches to surprise pig attacks. But you wear them because exposed ears in medieval winter might actually fall off. Now, let's discuss the tragedy that is medieval footwear. Shoes are simple leather affairs called turn shoes, made by sewing leather inside out, then turning it right side out. They have no real sole, no insulation, and definitely no waterproofing. They're essentially leather socks with delusions of grandeur. Within minutes of stepping outside, your feet are wet and getting wetter. Some people stuff their shoes with straw or hay for insulation, which works for about 5 minutes before the straw gets wet and starts decomposing. Now you're walking on rotting vegetation, which is exactly as comfortable and warm as it sounds. The wealthy might have wooden pattens, raised platforms that strap over shoes to lift you above the mud and snow. Everyone else just accepts that dry feet are a summer phenomenon. Leg coverings are an adventure in themselves. Men wear hose, not the tights you're thinking of, but separate leg coverings that tie to a belt. They're wool, of course, and they bag at the knees and ankles because elastic hasn't been invented yet. They're constantly falling down, letting cold air rush up your legs. Women's legs are theoretically covered by their dresses, but the reality is that wind finds its way under everything. Mittens exist, but they're a cruel joke. Made of wool or leather, they're either too thin to provide warmth or so thick you can't use your hands for anything. Most work requires bare hands or fingerless gloves, which means your fingers are in a constant state of painful cold. Frostbite is so common that missing fingertips are barely worth mentioning. Here's the real problem with medieval winter clothing. It doesn't actually work. Wool is warm when dry, but medieval life is incompatible with dryness. You sweat from work, get splashed with water, snow melts on you, and your clothes never fully dry. Wet wool is worse than no wool. It actively conducts heat away from your body. You're essentially wearing a full-body cooling system in conditions where you desperately need warmth. Cleaning clothes in winter is impossible. Washing requires water, which is frozen. It requires drying space, which doesn't exist. It requires the clothes to actually dry, which they won't in the humid, smoke-filled interior of your house. So you wear the same clothes continuously, adding layers as it gets colder, never removing them until spring. The smell is beyond description. It's not just body odor, it's months of accumulated sweat, smoke, spilled food, animal contact, and various bodily functions that didn't quite make it to the designated areas. Everyone smells the same, so no one notices. But if a medieval peasant were to time travel to the modern era, they'd clear a room just by entering. Patching and mending are constant winter activities. Fabric tears on frozen branches, wears thin at stress points, and generally disintegrates from hard use. But new fabric is expensive and possibly unavailable. So you patch patches, mend tears with whatever thread you can find, and gradually transform your clothes into a patchwork testament to poverty and determination. The psychological impact of never being properly warm, never being clean, never being comfortable in your clothes is profound. You forget what it feels like to not be itchy. You forget what your actual skin color is under the layers of dirt. You forget that clothes can be something other than a burden you carry on your body. Rich people's clothing is better, but only marginally. They have fur linings, which are warmer until they get wet. They have multiple layers of higher quality wool. They have actual shoes with soles, but they're still cold, still dirty by modern standards, and still fighting a losing battle against winter with textile technology that's barely adequate for autumn. This is medieval winter clothing, a collection of inadequate solutions to an impossible problem, worn by people who have no choice but to make do with what they have. It's not fashion. It's desperation wrapped in wool and held together with hope and twine. We need to talk about something modern people can't truly comprehend, the darkness of medieval winter. Not metaphorical darkness, actual, physical, all-consuming darkness that starts in late afternoon and doesn't let go until mid-morning. Imagine your life being plunged into blackness for 18 hours a day, every day, for months. The sun, that unreliable friend, makes only brief appearances in deep winter. It staggers above the horizon around 8 a.m. like a drunk who's lost their way, provides a few hours of weak, watery light, then gives up and disappears by 4 p.m. And that's on clear days. Most winter days are overcast, turning the pathetic daylight hours into a gray twilight that never quite commits to being actual illumination. This means you wake up in darkness, work in darkness, eat in darkness, and go to sleep in darkness. Your entire life becomes a shadow play where you navigate by memory, touch, and the occasional bruise from walking into things that weren't there yesterday. Indoor lighting is a comedy of inadequacy. Candles are expensive. A single candle costs what a laborer earns in a day. Only the wealthy can afford to burn them regularly. Everyone else makes do with rushlights, rushes soaked in animal fat that burn with a feeble smoke flame that provides about as much light as a dying firefly. They smell like burning hair, drip hot fat everywhere, and need constant attention to keep from going out. The hearth fire provides some light, but it's unpredictable. Sometimes it blazes and throws dancing shadows that make everything look demonic. Sometimes it's just embers glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. You learn to do everything by feel because seeing is a luxury you can't afford. This has profound practical implications. Any detailed work, sewing, carving, reading if you're one of the 0.1% who can, becomes impossible after sunset. You can't mend tools, fix clothes, or do anything requiring precision. Your productive hours shrink to match the daylight, turning you into a part-time human. But it's the psychological impact that really breaks people. Humans aren't meant to live in darkness. We're diurnal creatures who need light for our mental health, our circadian rhythms, our basic sense of well-being. Medieval winter is like a massive experiment in sensory deprivation, and the results are predictably terrible. Seasonal depression isn't just common, it's universal. Everyone sinks into a gray fog of hopelessness that matches the gray fog outside. But there's no concept of mental health, no understanding that lack of light affects mood. People just accept that winter makes you want to lie down and never get up again. It's God's will, apparently. God really has it out for people between November and March. The darkness brings its own terrors. Every sound is amplified when you can't see its source. That creaking could be the house settling or someone breaking in. That scratching could be a mouse or a demon. You can't check because you can't see, and investigating would mean using precious light or stumbling around in blackness. Folklore thrives in this darkness. Every culture has winter monsters that come out when the sun abandons the world. They're projections of the very real fear of the dark, given form and teeth and appetites. Parents tell children these stories, not as entertainment, but as warnings. Stay inside after dark. Don't stray from the path. The darkness is hungry, and you're made of meat. Crime increases in winter darkness. Thieves love the cover of 18-hour nights. You could be robbed by your own neighbor and never know because identifying someone in pitch blackness is impossible. Violence escalates because darkness provides anonymity. Rape, assault, murder, all easier when the victim can't see you coming and witnesses can't identify you. Navigation becomes a nightmare. There are no streetlights, no lit windows, no helpful signs. On overcast nights, you literally can't see your hand in front of your face. People get lost between their house and their barn. They fall into ditches, walk into walls, stumble over obstacles that daylight would make obvious. Winter nights claim victims who simply couldn't find their way home in the dark. The isolation is crushing. Once darkness falls, you're trapped wherever you are. Visiting neighbors becomes impossible. Community gatherings stop. You're locked in your hovel with the same people, staring at the same walls you can barely see, for 18 hours at a stretch. It's like voluntary solitary confinement, except you're sharing the cell with your entire family. Even the stars, which might provide some psychological comfort, are usually hidden by clouds. When they do appear, they're so bright they're almost painful to eyes accustomed to darkness. The Milky Way blazes across the sky like a river of light, beautiful but alien, reminding you how small and powerless you are against the vast darkness. Time becomes fluid in the darkness. Without clocks, without consistent light markers, hours blend together. Did you sleep for 2 hours or 6? Has it been dark for 10 hours or 14? Your body's rhythms, already disrupted by cold and hunger, completely abandon any pretense of normal cycles. You sleep when exhausted, wake when cold, exist in a temporal fog that matches the physical darkness. The dawn, when it finally comes, is less a revelation and more a reluctant admission that yes, the sun still exists. It creeps in slowly, turning black to gray to slightly lighter gray. By the time there's actual sunlight, you've been awake for hours, working by feel and habit in the darkness. This is medieval winter darkness, not just an absence of light, but an active presence that shapes every aspect of life. It's a months-long sensory deprivation experiment that breaks minds, enables crimes, and makes the simplest tasks monumentally difficult. Modern people complain about the sun setting at 5 p.m. Medieval people watched it disappear at 4 p.m. and knew they wouldn't see real light again for 16 hours. The darkness doesn't just surround you, it infiltrates you, fills your lungs, seeps into your bones. You breathe darkness, eat darkness, dream in darkness. It becomes such a constant companion that when spring finally brings longer days, the light almost hurts. You've adapted to the darkness so thoroughly that sunlight feels like an assault. But that's still months away. For now, you exist in a world where darkness rules, where light is a brief visitor, and where your entire life is lived in shadows. Welcome to medieval winter nights, where the darkness isn't just long, it's alive, and it's hungry. Death in medieval winter isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or give you time to prepare meaningful last words. It sidles up quietly, dressed as exhaustion, and by the time you recognize it, it's already making itself comfortable in your chest. The death rate in winter triples compared to summer. This isn't surprising when you consider that everything about medieval winter is actively trying to kill you, but the sheer variety of ways to die would impress even the most creative modern horror writer. Let's explore the menu of mortality, shall we? Hypothermia is the classic, the old reliable, the baseline death that's always waiting. It starts subtly, shivering, numbness, confusion. Your body pulls blood from your extremities to protect vital organs. Your fingers and toes blacken with frostbite. Your thinking becomes muddled. You make poor decisions, like going outside without your cloak because you feel warm now. This paradoxical warming is your body giving up, dumping its last reserves of energy in a final biological shrug. You die feeling almost comfortable, which is nature's only mercy in this whole cruel process. But hypothermia is for amateurs. Real medieval winter deaths come from the cascade of failures that cold triggers. Your weakened immune system invites in pneumonia, which fills your lungs with fluid. You drown in your own body while your family watches helplessly. The coughing is constant, productive, and bloody. Each breath is a wet rattle. The fever alternates with chills. Medieval medicine offers hot poultices that burn your chest and prayers that do nothing for your oxygen levels. Starvation doesn't kill quickly. It's a slow strip mining of your body's resources. First, you burn through fat reserves, then muscle. Your body starts consuming itself, breaking down proteins from wherever it can find them. Your heart muscle weakens, your brain function deteriorates. You become skeletal with skin hanging loose on bones. Hair falls out, teeth loosen. Eventually an organ fails, usually the heart, sometimes the liver. You die looking like a badly preserved mummy. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires is the silent killer. You get sleepy, develop a headache, feel nauseous. Your family assumes you're just tired from work. You lie down near the fire for warmth and never wake up. Sometimes entire families are found dead, peaceful-looking, victims of the very fires that were supposed to save them. Accidents multiply in winter. Ice makes every surface treacherous. You slip carrying water, crack your head, and freeze to death unconscious in the snow. You fall through ice trying to get water or catch fish. The shock of cold water paralyzes your muscles. You sink like a stone while your neighbors watch, unable to help without risking the same fate. Burns are paradoxically common in winter. Desperate for warmth, people get too close to fires. Clothing, stiff with dirt and grease, ignites easily. In a one-room house, there's nowhere to stop, drop, and roll. The same cold that you're trying to escape prevents proper burn treatment. Infections are guaranteed. You die slowly from sepsis, your burns never healing in the cold, damp conditions. Infections that would be minor in summer become death sentences in winter. That small cut from chopping wood, It doesn't heal properly when you're malnourished and cold. It festers, spreads. Blood poisoning sets in. You develop a fever in conditions where fever is deadly. Your body can't maintain temperature regulation. You die shaking from both cold and infection. Animals, desperate and starving, become bold. Wolves come into villages, no longer afraid of humans. They take children first, easier prey. The attacks are efficient, going for the throat. If you survive the initial attack, you die from blood loss or infection. There's no rabies vaccine, so a bite from a rabid animal is a death sentence played out in horrifying convulsions. Structural collapse is a special winter treat. Roofs, heavy with snow and ice, give way without warning. You're crushed in your sleep by the very shelter meant to protect you. Or walls, weakened by freeze-thaw cycles, crumble. Your house literally falls apart around you, leaving you exposed to elements that kill within hours. Domestic violence escalates to murder in winter's pressure cooker conditions. Confined spaces, alcohol consumption, and stress create a toxic mix. Women and children are usual victims. The bodies aren't found until spring, frozen in positions that tell their own stories. Justice is rare. Who can prove what happened in the darkness of a winter night? Childbirth in winter has mortality rates that would constitute a humanitarian crisis today. The cold stress triggers early labor. Babies born premature in medieval winter don't survive. Even full-term births are dangerous. Mothers hemorrhage with no medical help. Newborns can't maintain body temperature. They die within hours, blue and still. The mother often follows, weakened by blood loss and unable to fight off infection. But perhaps the cruelest deaths are the slow ones from chronic conditions exacerbated by winter. That persistent cough becomes tuberculosis. That joint pain becomes crippling arthritis that prevents work, leading to starvation. That tooth infection spreads to the jaw, the blood, the brain. You die by inches, fully aware of what's happening but powerless to stop it. The rituals around death adapt to winter realities. Bodies freeze solid, making preparation difficult. The ground is too hard for burial. Corpses are stored in outbuildings until spring thaw. Imagine living with your dead grandmother's frozen body in the barn for 3 months. The psychological trauma is profound but unacknowledged. Funeral rites are abbreviated or postponed. The church is too cold for lengthy services. Mourners can't travel in deep snow. The dead are sent off with minimal ceremony, their souls commended to God with chattering teeth and frozen tears. The living develop a fatalistic acceptance. Death becomes so common it loses its sting. You wake up, check if everyone's still breathing, and get on with your day. Children who survive their first winter are considered hardy. Those who don't are barely mourned. Why get attached when death is always one cold night away? This constant presence of death shapes everything. Every decision is made with mortality in mind. Do you share your food with a sick neighbor, knowing it might mean your own starvation? Do you risk traveling for medicine that probably won't work? Do you burn your seed grain to keep warm, choosing immediate survival over future planting? Medieval winter death isn't noble or meaningful. It's mundane, messy, and utterly without dignity. You die covered in your own waste because you're too weak to make it to the bucket. You die alone because your family is too exhausted to stay awake for another death watch. You die knowing that your body will freeze solid and be stacked like cordwood until the ground thaws enough for burial. The survivors aren't blessed. They're just not dead yet. They carry the weight of all those deaths, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, the knowledge that next winter will bring the same harvest of corpses. They become intimately familiar with death's face, its smell, its casual cruelty. This is death in medieval winter. Not a singular event, but a constant presence, patient and persistent, taking its toll body by body, family by family, until spring finally arrives to count the cost. You might think that wealth and status would protect you from medieval winter's cruelty. After all, nobles had stone castles, fur-lined clothes, and enough food to last through siege, let alone winter. Surely they spent the cold months in relative comfort? Oh, you sweet, naive soul. Let me tell you about the spectacular ways the upper classes suffered through winter. Because money can't buy you central heating in the 14th century. Let's start with those magnificent castles. From the outside, they look impregnable. Massive stone walls, towers reaching toward heaven, the ultimate in medieval security. From the inside, they're essentially giant stone refrigerators with extra drafts. Stone doesn't insulate, it absorbs cold and radiates it back at you like a passive-aggressive roommate. Touch a castle wall in winter and you'll leave skin behind. The great halls, those soaring spaces designed to impress, are impossible to heat. You could burn an entire forest in the massive fireplaces and still only warm a small radius around the hearth. The heat rises to the vaulted ceiling where no one lives, while the humans huddle at ground level like well-dressed penguins. The Lord's high table is placed near the fire, but even there, you're warm on one side and freezing on the other, constantly rotating like a rotisserie noble. Private chambers aren't much better. They're smaller, yes, but still stone-walled and often located in towers where wind hits from all directions. Windows are a particular torture, large enough to let in light and arrows, covered with expensive glass that does nothing for insulation. The nobility are essentially paying extra to freeze in style. Shutters help, but then you're in darkness. It's a choice between seeing your luxury or feeling your fingers. The beds are the only real refuge. Massive four-poster affairs with heavy curtains on all sides, creating a tent within the room. Once you climb in and draw the curtains, your body heat slowly warms the enclosed space. Of course, this means spending 14 to 16 hours a day in bed, which sounds luxurious until you realize there's nothing else to do and nowhere else to be warm. Noble clothing is better than peasant rags, but only marginally. You have fur-lined cloaks, ermine, sable, fox if they're really wealthy. But fur only works if it stays dry, and castles are damp. That expensive ermine lining becomes a soggy, matted mess that smells like wet dog and provides about as much warmth. Multiple layers of silk and velvet look impressive, but provide less insulation than good wool. Fashion demands suffering, and medieval noble fashion demands hypothermia with style. Food is plentiful, but monotonous. Preserved meat, dried fruits, expensive spices to disguise the taste of semi-rotten ingredients. Fresh vegetables are as rare for nobles as peasants in winter. The difference is that nobles can afford to be picky, which means wasting food while peasants would kill for their scraps. The irony of having enough food but it all tasting like salted leather isn't lost on anyone. Hygiene is a particular noble problem. Peasants have given up on cleanliness, but nobles are expected to maintain standards. This means washing in water that has to be heated bucket by bucket and carried up narrow spiral staircases. By the time your bath is ready, it's lukewarm. You sit in a wooden tub in a drafty room, shivering violently while servants pour tepid water over you. It's less cleaning and more ritual suffering. Entertainment becomes desperate. You can't hunt, the forests are snowed in and the game is scarce. You can't travel, the roads are impassable. You can't even walk the gardens, they're buried under snow. So you're trapped in your cold stone box with the same people, day after day. Chess becomes less game and more psychological warfare. Music practice happens with numb fingers. Reading requires squinting by candlelight until your eyes feel like they're bleeding. The politics of noble winter isolation are vicious. Confined quarters mean every slight is magnified. Old grievances fester. Alliances shift based on who controls the warmest spots near the fire. Servants become spy networks. Everyone is watching everyone else because there's literally nothing else to do. Winter courts are hotbeds of intrigue born from boredom and proximity. Noble women suffer specifically gendered winter tortures. Fashion demands low necklines and tight sleeves that offer no protection. Pregnancy and childbirth in cold castles have mortality rates that make peasant births look safe. The expectation to remain beautiful and composed while freezing creates its own psychological torture. Makeup cracks in the cold, hair freezes when washed, skin chaps and roughens. But God forbid you appear at dinner looking weather-beaten. Children of nobility aren't coddled, they're toughened. The belief that cold builds character means young nobles are deliberately exposed to harsh conditions. They sleep in unheated rooms, wash in cold water, and are expected not to complain. The mortality rate is lower than peasant children only because they have better nutrition, not because they're warmer. The real noble privilege is mobility, theoretically. In practice, winter travel for nobles is a nightmare of logistics. A noble household can't just walk to the next castle. They need carriages for the ladies, wagons for belongings, guards for protection, servants for everything. This cavalcade moves at the pace of the slowest cart on roads that are often impassable. Getting stranded between castles is a real possibility, and freezing to death in a velvet-lined carriage is only marginally more dignified than freezing in a ditch. Medical care for nobles is better in that they can afford doctors. Unfortunately, medieval doctors are just as likely to kill you. They just do it with more expensive methods. Nobles get the premium bloodletting, the imported leeches, the rare herbs that are probably poisonous. They die from the same diseases as peasants, but with fancier last rites. The psychological toll of noble winter is unique. You have resources but can't use them effectively. You have education but nothing to apply it to. You have power but nowhere to exercise it. You're trapped in a beautiful prison, slowly going mad from cold and boredom while maintaining the facade that this is somehow better than peasant life. The relationship between nobles and servants becomes strained in winter. Servants sleep in even colder quarters, eat worse food, but have to maintain noble comfort. The resentment is palpable. Nobles depend entirely on servants but treat them terribly. It's a powder keg of class tension compressed by cold and proximity. Small rebellions happen, food served cold, fires accidentally dying, messages delivered slowly. Some nobles try to flee south for winter, but medieval logistics make this nearly impossible for most. Those who attempt it risk everything. Brigands who specifically target rich winter travelers, weather that can turn deadly in hours, the possibility of returning to find your castle occupied by someone else who decided possession is 9/10 of the law. This is noble winter life, all the discomforts of peasant existence, plus the added burden of maintaining appearances. You're cold in silk instead of wool, hungry for variety instead of quantity, and bored instead of exhausted. It's a different flavor of misery, served on silver plates in rooms that cost a fortune to not heat properly. The peasants looking up at those castle walls imagine warmth and comfort inside. The nobles looking out know better. They're all freezing together, just at different altitudes. Winter is the great equalizer, and it doesn't care about your title. A duke's frostbite hurts just as much as a peasant's. The only difference is the duke's is wrapped in ermine while it turns black. Let's talk about what months of cold, darkness, hunger, and isolation do to the human mind. Because medieval winter wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a psychological marathon that broke people in ways that would have modern psychiatrists reaching for their entire prescription pad. Imagine your mental state after just 1 week of medieval winter. Constantly cold, barely enough food, trapped in a smoke-filled room with your entire extended family, working brutal hours in freezing conditions, surrounded by darkness 18 hours a day. Now multiply that by 16 to 20 weeks. The human psyche isn't designed for this level of sustained misery. Seasonal affective disorder is a cute modern term for what happens when people don't get enough sunlight. In medieval times, it wasn't a disorder. It was the universal human condition from November to March. Everyone sank into a gray fog of hopelessness that matched the gray skies outside. But there was no understanding of brain chemistry, no concept that light affects mood. People just accepted that winter made you want to die, and many did. The constant physical discomfort creates a baseline of misery that colors everything. You're never not in pain. Your joints ache from cold, your skin cracks and bleeds, your teeth hurt, your stomach gnaws with hunger, your head pounds from smoke inhalation. This chronic pain state fundamentally alters personality. Kind people become cruel, patient people snap. Strong people crumble. Cabin fever in a medieval context is extreme. You're not just stuck indoors, you're stuck in a single room with a dozen people. No privacy, no personal space, no escape. Every annoying habit is magnified. Every old resentment festers. Domestic violence skyrockets. Child abuse becomes normalized. Murder rates triple. And everyone pretends this is normal because what's the alternative? The isolation from the broader community is devastating. Humans are social creatures, but winter cuts you off from everyone outside your immediate household. No market days, no church socializing, no tavern visits. Your world shrinks to the same faces, the same walls, the same conversations repeated endlessly. Vocabulary actually decreases over winter as people have nothing new to talk about. Children develop differently when raised in these conditions. Winter babies often show signs of developmental delays, not from any genetic issue but from months of understimulation in dark, confined spaces. They learn that crying brings no comfort because everyone is too exhausted to respond. They internalize a worldview where suffering is normal and joy is suspicious. The mental load of constant calculation is exhausting. Every decision requires complex math. Burn more wood now or save it and risk freezing later? Eat more today or save food and risk starving next month? Share with neighbors or hoard and risk social isolation? Your brain never rests, constantly running survival scenarios that all end badly. Anxiety becomes a constant companion. Not modern anxiety about deadlines or social media, but primal anxiety about death. Will the food last? Will the fire die? Will the roof collapse? Will the wolves come? Will this cough become pneumonia? Every night you go to sleep wondering if you'll wake up, if your children will wake up, if morning will come at all. Depression isn't just common, it's rational. When your objective reality is brutal, hopelessness is logical. The church preaches about suffering being holy, but that's cold comfort when you're watching your children waste away. People develop a fatalistic acceptance that life is meant to be horrible, that happiness is a trap, that hoping for better is dangerous. Trauma compounds generationally. Parents who survived brutal winters inflict that trauma on their children through harsh discipline, emotional unavailability, and teaching them that warmth and comfort are dangerous illusions. Children grow up hyper-vigilant, always waiting for the next catastrophe, unable to relax even in summer because winter is always coming. The development of what we'd now recognize as PTSD is universal. Everyone has flashbacks to previous winter disasters. The sound of wind triggers panic. The first frost sends people into preparation frenzies that border on mania. Summer is spent dreading winter rather than enjoying warmth. The trauma never fully heals because it's reinforced annually. Psychosis from isolation, malnutrition, and stress becomes common by late winter. People start seeing things in the shadows, hearing voices in the wind, believing their neighbors are plotting against them, which sometimes they are. The line between reasonable caution and paranoid delusion blurs when actual threats are everywhere. Coping mechanisms are uniformly unhealthy. Alcohol consumption increases despite resources being scarce. Violence becomes a release valve. Religion becomes increasingly extreme. Flagellation, excessive fasting, apocalyptic visions. Self-harm provides a sense of control. Eating disorders develop from the feast-famine cycle. Social bonds fracture under pressure. Marriages that seem strong in summer collapse in winter. Friendships end over borrowed grain. Community solidarity gives way to every family for themselves thinking. Trust becomes a luxury no one can afford. The social fabric doesn't just fray, it shreds. The concept of learned helplessness perfectly describes medieval winter psychology. When nothing you do improves your situation, when every effort fails, when suffering is inevitable regardless of action, people stop trying. They become passive, accepting whatever happens. This isn't weakness, it's a logical response to an impossible situation. Memory becomes unreliable under chronic stress. People forget things that happened last week but vividly remember traumas from years ago. Time becomes fluid. Days blend together. Months pass in a fog. Spring seems like a myth, even when the calendar says it's close. The mind protects itself by dissociating from the present. Suicide rates, while not officially recorded, clearly spike in winter. Bodies found in spring aren't all accidental freezing deaths. The Church condemns suicide as mortal sin, but when hell seems preferable to another month of winter, theological threats lose their power. Families quietly bury suicides in unconsecrated ground and never speak of it. The psychological scars last long after spring arrives. People hoard food even in times of plenty. They overreact to minor cold. They can't enjoy summer fully because they're already dreading the return of winter. Anxiety, depression, and trauma responses become permanent personality features passed down through generations. This is the hidden cost of medieval winter. Not just the physical suffering, but the systematic destruction of mental health across entire populations. It creates a society of traumatized people who see life as something to endure rather than enjoy, who view comfort with suspicion and happiness as dangerous. Modern psychology would recognize medieval winter as a massive, recurring collective trauma that shaped the European psyche for centuries. The stoicism, fatalism, and grimness often associated with medieval culture. That's not cultural. That's what happens when entire populations develop complex PTSD from seasonal trauma. The human mind can adapt to almost anything, but that adaptation comes at a cost. Medieval people survived winter psychologically the same way they survived it physically, by becoming harder, colder, and less human. They shut down emotions that made them vulnerable. They accepted cruelty as normal. They learned to find meaning in suffering because the alternative was madness. And perhaps most tragically, they passed all of this on to their children, who passed it on to theirs, creating a multi-generational cycle of winter-induced trauma that shaped European culture in ways we're only beginning to understand. Let me tell you about the winters that were so brutal, so catastrophic, that they burned themselves into historical memory. These weren't just bad winters. They were civilization-ending events that killed millions and reshaped European society. The winter of 1315–1316 opened what historians cheerfully call the Great Famine. It started with rain. Not normal rain, but biblical, civilization-drowning rain that began in spring 1315 and simply didn't stop. Crops rotted in the fields, hay couldn't be dried. The rain continued through autumn, then turned to snow. When winter proper arrived, Europe was already starving. Temperatures plummeted to levels that made normal medieval winters look tropical. The Baltic Sea froze solid. You could walk from Germany to Sweden. Rivers became highways of ice, but there was nowhere to go because everyone was starving equally. The rain had destroyed 3 consecutive harvests across the continent. People ate anything: grass, bark, leather, cats, dogs, horses. When those ran out, darker rumors spread. Chroniclers write delicately about unnatural foods, and parents who loved their children too much to watch them starve. Let that sink in. The winter was so brutal that cannibalism became common enough to be referenced in multiple independent sources. Cities became charnel houses. London lost 15% of its population. Paris saw bodies stacked in the streets because the ground was too frozen to dig graves, and there were too many dead to store. Entire villages simply disappeared, their populations either dead or fled. When census takers came through in spring, they found empty homes with scratch marks on the walls where people had tried to eat the daub. The Great Famine lasted until 1322. 7 years. 7 winters, where people who survived 1 year of starvation had to face another with depleted bodies and broken spirits. Population levels didn't recover for 2 centuries. An entire generation grew up stunted, physically and mentally damaged by prolonged malnutrition. But that was just the warm-up act. The winter of 1348 to 1349 brought a special guest, the Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe during autumn 1348, just in time for winter to trap people indoors with the infected. Medieval quarantine meant shutting plague victims inside their homes with their families and nailing the doors shut. In winter, this meant choosing between certain death from disease or certain death from cold. The plague was horrific enough in summer, but winter added new dimensions of horror. Bodies froze before they could be buried, stacking up like cordwood. The ground was too hard to dig graves, so corpses were stored wherever space allowed. Churches became morgues. Homes became tombs. The sick were often thrown out into the snow to die rather than infect others, freezing to death while their lymph nodes swelled with plague. Entire communities made group suicide pacts rather than face slow death from plague and cold. Monks recorded finding villages where every soul had gathered in the church and died together. Whether from disease, cold, or more deliberate means was impossible to determine. The apocalyptic mindset wasn't metaphorical. People genuinely believed the world was ending. The winter of 1407-1408 brought a different kind of horror. Chroniclers called it the Great Winter, or Winter of Winters. The Thames froze solid enough to hold markets on the ice. Wine froze in barrels and shattered the wood. Trees exploded from their sap freezing. Birds fell dead from the sky, frozen in mid-flight. But the real horror was the wolves. Driven by starvation, wolf packs entered cities. Not villages, cities. Paris recorded wolves hunting in packs through the streets, taking children, attacking adults. The city gates had to be guarded not against human enemies but against wolves, so desperate they'd lost all fear of humans. When the wolves were finally killed or driven off, people were so hungry they ate the wolf corpses, parasites and all. The winter of 1432-1433 hit Scotland particularly hard. The Scots called it the Winter of the Black Death of Cattle. Every cow, sheep, and goat in entire regions died. Not some, all. The ground was littered with frozen livestock. People tried to eat the frozen carcasses, but many were diseased. Attempting to cook frozen, rotting meat over inadequate fires led to mass food poisoning. Survivors reported that the smell of death was so thick it could be tasted. The Little Ice Age, from roughly 1300 to 1850, wasn't a single event but centuries of brutal winters. The Baltic Sea froze solid in 1323, 1407, 1423, 1425, 1435, 1443, 1458, you get the idea. Each freeze wasn't just a weather event, it meant trade stopped, fish couldn't be caught, and anyone caught traveling died. The winter of 1490 to 1491 was so cold that wolves crossed the frozen sea from Norway to Denmark. Think about that. The sea froze solid enough that wolf packs could migrate across it. The Danish recorded hunting wolves that spoke Norwegian, probably just a different howl pattern, but the idea that foreign wolves were invading added to the apocalyptic feel. Village records from these extreme winters read like horror stories. One English village recorded in 1434, "No bird song from St. Martin's Day to Candlemas." The silence was deemed unnatural, and many thought it presaged the end times. Another from 1465, "The children born this winter had blue lips that never turned pink." Most died before spring, and those that lived were simple-minded. The psychological impact of these historic winters lasted generations. Survivors developed cultural trauma that manifested in folklore, religious extremism, and brutal social practices. The witch trials of the 16th–17th centuries correlate strongly with the worst winters of the Little Ice Age. When crops failed and children died, someone had to be blamed. Thousands of women burned because winter was colder than usual. These historical horror winters weren't just weather events. They were civilization-altering catastrophes that killed millions, toppled governments, started wars, and fundamentally changed how Europeans viewed the world. They proved that winter wasn't just a season to be endured, but an existential threat that could, and repeatedly did, nearly wipe out human civilization in Europe. The survivors of these winters didn't just experience trauma, they experienced the collapse of everything they knew. Social order, religious faith, basic human decency, all of it crumbled when the cold became severe enough and lasted long enough. These weren't people living through hard times. They were people living through the apocalypse multiple times and somehow continuing to exist. That's the true horror of historical medieval winters. Not just that they were brutal, but that they were brutal beyond the capacity of human endurance. And yet humans endured, scarred, traumatized, fundamentally changed, but still stubbornly alive. Though you have to wonder if the survivors envied the dead. You've made it. Somehow, impossibly, after months of horror that would break modern humans in days, you've survived to see the first hints of spring. But here's the cruelest joke of all. Early spring is often the deadliest time of year. The calendar says March, but winter hasn't gotten the memo. The cold snaps back with vicious unpredictability. One day it's warm enough to melt snow, flooding your home with ice water. The next day, everything refreezes, turning the world into a skating rink of death. These freeze-thaw cycles are more dangerous than consistent cold. Ice becomes unpredictable. Roofs collapse from the weight of melting and refreezing snow. Avalanches claim entire villages that survived the worst of winter only to die when hope was in sight. Your food stores, carefully rationed to last until spring harvest, are nearly gone. But spring harvest is still months away. This is the starving time, the gap between stored food running out and new food growing. Your body, already pushed to its limits, faces its greatest test just when you thought you were safe. The melting snow reveals winter's true cost. Bodies emerge from drifts, travelers who got lost, children who wandered off, elderly who went for walks. The spring body count is always higher than anyone wants to admit. Each corpse is a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, just lucky. Disease explodes in spring. All those months of weakened immune systems, poor nutrition, and close confinement create perfect conditions for epidemics. The same warming that brings hope also brings flies, mosquitoes, and the rapid decomposition of all the waste that was frozen for months. Typhoid, dysentery, and mysterious spring fevers race through populations already pushed to their limits. Animals that survived winter are walking skeletons. Cows give no milk. Chickens lay no eggs. Draft animals are too weak to plow. But the fields must be prepared now or there will be no harvest, which means no survival through next winter. You're forced to push skeletal oxen and horses, knowing you might kill them because the alternative is certain starvation. The psychological whiplash is devastating. You've trained yourself to expect nothing but suffering. Hope became dangerous. Now you're supposed to believe in future harvests, in warmth, in survival. The mind rebels. Spring suicides are common. People who endured the worst of winter, but couldn't handle the transition back to hope. Work that was impossible in winter now becomes urgently necessary. Fields must be plowed through still frozen soil. Repairs delayed by cold must happen immediately before spring rains. Everything needs doing at once, but your body is broken from winter. You're trying to do heavy labor on a skeleton's strength, and a starvation diet. The social contracts that dissolved in winter's desperation must be hastily rebuilt. The neighbor you considered eating must now help you plow. The relative you threw out to save food wants their property back. The community that fragmented must somehow unite for spring planting. Forgiveness is mandatory but not felt. Children born in winter face their first real test in spring. Many seemed healthy in the dim winter light, but spring sunshine reveals rickets, developmental delays, and failure to thrive. The babies who survived winter often die in spring when their deformities become undeniable. Parents who fought so hard to keep them alive through cold months watch them fade just as the world turns green. Fall springs are particularly cruel. A week of warm weather triggers planting, only for a late freeze to kill everything. Years of carefully saved seed grain, planted in desperate hope, dies in a single night. Now you have no harvest and no way to try again. These agricultural disasters can destroy entire regions that survived winter only to starve in summer. The rich, who hoarded resources through winter, now extract their price. Loans taken in desperation must be repaid. Labor owed accumulates interest. The power dynamics that were suspended by mutual suffering reassert themselves with vengeance. Spring is when the poor pay for winter survival with summer servitude. Even the sunshine hurts. Months in smoke-darkened homes leaves eyes sensitive to light. Vitamin D deficiency means the sun burns skin that hasn't seen light since October. The warmth you craved causes its own problems. Too much too fast leads to heat exhaustion in bodies that forgot how to regulate temperature. Planting becomes a desperate gamble. Plant too early and late, frost kills everything. Plant too late and crops won't mature before next winter. But you're making these critical decisions with a brain foggy from months of malnutrition and trauma. Mistakes made in spring's planting are paid for in next winter's starvation. The emotional burden of survival guilt hits hard in spring. Why did you live when your neighbor died? Why did your children survive when better people's didn't? The randomness of who made it through winter challenges any belief in divine justice. Survivor's guilt mixes with exhaustion to create a unique spring depression. And underneath the desperate activity, the frantic planting and repairing and hoping, lies the knowledge that crushes souls. Winter will come again. In just 6 months, this brief reprieve will end. The cold will return, the darkness will descend, the hunger will gnaw. Everything you're working so desperately to achieve is just preparation for another round of suffering. This is the cruelest part of spring. It's not an ending, but a pause. You haven't escaped winter. You've just earned the privilege of preparing for the next one. Every seed planted is hope for surviving future cold. Every repair is an attempt to suffer less next time. Every moment of warmth is shadowed by the knowledge of returning frost. Some break under this knowledge. They can't face another cycle. They've used up their lifetime supply of endurance in one winter and have nothing left for the next. Spring madness is real. People who survived winter's worst but crack under spring's cruel promise of temporary reprieve. But somehow, impossibly, most continue. They plant despite exhaustion. They hope despite experience. They prepare for the next winter while still healing from the last. It's not courage, it's the absence of alternatives. When your only choices are prepare for next winter or die before it arrives, you prepare. Spring isn't salvation, it's a work camp where broken people prepare for their next ordeal. The birds sing, flowers bloom, and life returns to the world, but it's all temporary. Everyone knows it. The cycle continues, relentless and unforgiving. You've survived one winter, but that just means you get to face another. Welcome to spring in medieval times, where hope itself becomes a burden and survival feels more like a curse than a blessing. The winter is over, but it's never really over. It's just waiting, gathering strength, preparing to test you again and again and again, until eventually, inevitably, winter wins. So here we are at the end of our journey through the frozen hell of medieval winter. You've walked in the worn shoes, or more likely, the rag-wrapped feet of people who faced months of cold that would send modern humans to the hospital in hours. You felt the hunger that gnaws not just at your stomach, but at your sanity. You've experienced the darkness that swallows days and the diseases that turn bodies into battlegrounds. But the real question is, how did they do it? How did generation after generation of humans endure conditions that seem literally unsurvivable? The answer isn't comfortable or inspiring. They survived because the alternative was dying. And they survived at a cost that fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. Medieval winter carved deep grooves in the European psyche that persist to this day. That stoicism you see in old photographs? That's not cultural. That's what happens when smiling wastes precious calories. The grimness of medieval art? That's not artistic choice. That's what the world looks like when you spend half your life in frozen darkness. The fatalism of medieval religion? That makes perfect sense when God seems to actively hate you for 4 months every year. These people didn't just survive winter, they were shaped by it at a cellular level. Epigenetics tells us that trauma changes our DNA expression, passing down biological responses to stress. Every medieval person who survived winter passed on genes primed for starvation, cold, and suffering. We are, quite literally, the descendants of people whose bodies learned to expect horror. The social structures that seem so cruel to modern eyes, the rigid hierarchies, the acceptance of suffering, the casual brutality, these weren't character flaws. They were survival adaptations. When resources are so scarce that sharing means everyone dies, selfishness becomes a virtue. When heat is precious, only the valuable get to be warm. When food is limited, the weak are sacrificed. Medieval society wasn't built on cruelty. It was built on the mathematical reality of not enough to go around. The psychological adaptations run even deeper. The ability to dissociate from physical discomfort, to accept pain as background noise, to continue functioning while suffering, these traits were selected for as surely as resistance to cold. Those who couldn't adapt, who couldn't shut down their emotional responses to constant trauma, didn't survive to reproduce. We're descended from the ones who could watch their children suffer and keep working because stopping meant everyone died. Religion took on the shape of winter trauma. A God who demands suffering makes sense when suffering is inevitable. Heaven as a place of warmth and plenty is the desperate dream of people who've never known either. Hell as a place of ice and darkness? That's not imagination. That's Tuesday in January. The medieval Christian worldview, with its emphasis on enduring earthly suffering for heavenly reward, is perfectly adapted to people who have no choice but to suffer. The impact rippled through centuries. The Protestant work ethic that shaped modern capitalism? That's the voice of ancestors who knew that constant labor was the only barrier between you and freezing. The Northern European tendency toward planning and preparation. That's genetic memory of winters that killed the improvident. The cultural celebration of suffering as character building, that's generational trauma, repackaged as wisdom. Even our modern relationship with comfort is shaped by medieval winter. The Northern European discomfort with too much ease, the suspicion of luxury, the belief that hardship is somehow morally improving, these are the echoes of ancestors for whom comfort was literally deadly. When warmth meant lowered vigilance, and lowered vigilance meant death, the survivors were the ones who stayed uncomfortable and alert. The gender roles that persisted into modernity were forged in winter's crucible. When physical strength meant the difference between gathering enough firewood or freezing, when pregnancy in winter had a 50% mortality rate, when children needed constant care just to survive, the division of labor wasn't about oppression, but about maximizing survival odds. These patterns, born of desperate necessity, fossilized into social structures that long outlasted their original purpose. The very fact that you exist is a testament to impossible endurance. Every single one of your ancestors survived multiple medieval winters. Think about those odds. In some years, winter mortality reached 25%. Over a lifetime of 40 years, experiencing 40 winters, the cumulative probability of survival was minuscule. You're not just descended from survivors, you're descended from statistical miracles. But survival came at a cost measured in more than lives. It was measured in humanity itself. The capacity for joy, for trust, for believing in better futures, these were luxuries that winter stripped away. What remained was endurance without hope, survival without living, existence pared down to its most basic biological functions. The communities that emerged from winter were scarred in ways that shaped civilization. The suspicion of outsiders, when resources are scarce, strangers are threats. The harsh justice systems, when margin for error is zero, mercy becomes deadly. The acceptance of child mortality, when half of children die, emotional attachment becomes a liability. These weren't choices, they were adaptations. Perhaps most tragically, they normalized suffering to such an extent that unnecessary suffering became acceptable. The idea that pain builds character, that comfort weakens, that suffering is somehow noble, these toxic beliefs are the ghosts of medieval winter haunting modern minds. We've inherited the trauma responses of ancestors who had no choice but to suffer, and we've turned them into virtues. The miracle isn't that they survived, it's that they retained any humanity at all. That despite everything, they still told stories, still sang songs, still fell in love. That in the brief summers between winters, they created art and beauty and meaning. That they didn't just endure, but somehow continued to hope, even when hope was objectively irrational. When spring finally came each year, it wasn't just a season changing. It was a collective exhalation of breath held too long. The survivors would emerge, blinking in sunlight that seemed alien after months of darkness, and somehow find the strength to begin again. To plant crops, repair homes, make children who would face their own winters. It wasn't optimism, it was the absence of alternatives. But in that grim determination lies something almost admirable. We conquered winter eventually. Slowly, painfully, over centuries, we built better homes, better heating, better food preservation. We turned winter from an existential threat into a minor inconvenience. But we carry the scars in our genes, our cultures, our fundamental assumptions about how life works. Every time we tell ourselves that suffering builds character, we're hearing the voice of an ancestor who had no choice but to believe that. The medieval peasant shivering in their hovel wasn't noble or strong or admirable. They were desperate, traumatized, and doing whatever it took to see another day. Their survival wasn't a triumph of the human spirit. It was a grinding, dehumanizing slog through months of horror. They didn't overcome through courage, but through the simple inability to do anything else. But they survived. Against odds that seem impossible, against conditions that would kill modern humans in days, against a natural world that seemed designed to erase them, they survived. Not because they were special, but because they were stubborn. Not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. Not because they hoped, but because they endured. And in that endurance, perhaps, lies the only lesson worth taking from medieval winter. Sometimes survival isn't about being extraordinary. Sometimes it's about being too stubborn to die, too invested in tomorrow to give up today, too human to let winter win. They survived not as heroes, but as humans, flawed and suffering and somehow continuing anyway. That's the real price of survival. Not death, but the slow erosion of everything that makes life worth living, endured because the alternative is worse. They paid that price year after year, generation after generation, until finally their descendants could build a world where winter no longer kills. Where warmth is a button press away, Food is abundant, and darkness is optional. We are the children of winter survivors, carrying their trauma and their tenacity in equal measure. When we complain about the cold, we're expressing the genetic memory of ancestors who knew cold as death. When we hoard resources, we're following patterns set by people who knew scarcity intimately. When we endure suffering, believing it makes us stronger, we're echoing the voices of people who had no choice but to believe that. The medieval winter is over, but its shadows are long. In our heated homes with full refrigerators and electric lights, we're living the impossible dream of peasants who couldn't imagine such wealth. Every comfort we take for granted was bought with centuries of suffering. Every moment of warmth is a victory over winters that tried to erase us. So tonight, as you settle into your climate-controlled comfort, spare a thought for them. Not romanticized ancestors nobly enduring hardship, but real people who suffered unimaginably and survived anyway. People who paid the price for the warmth you're enjoying right now. People who endured the unendurable so that someday, impossibly, their descendants wouldn't have to. The winter is over. We won. But the victory came at a price measured in millions of lives and countless moments of human suffering. We're the descendants of those who paid that price, who survived the unsurvivable, who endured when endurance seemed impossible. And if they could survive medieval winter, perhaps we can survive whatever challenges our own time throws at us. Not because we're strong or noble or special, but because we're the children of people too stubborn to let winter win. That's their gift to us, not inspiration but existence itself, bought with frozen tears and impossible endurance. The medieval winter is over. But in our genes, our cultures, and our deepest assumptions about life, it never really ended. We're all survivors of winters we never experienced, shaped by cold we never felt, scarred by traumas we never endured. That's the final cruel joke of medieval winter. Even in defeating it, we carry it with us forever, but we carry their survival too. And in the end, that's all that matters. They endured, so we exist. In the face of conditions that should have erased them, they persisted. And because of their impossible, grinding, dehumanizing survival, we're here. Warm, fed, and alive. That's the price of survival. That's the gift of endurance. That's the legacy of medieval winter. Not just the trauma, but the triumph. Not just the suffering, but the stubborn refusal to be erased. They survived. Against all odds and at terrible cost. And so do we.